Introduction. I'm not sure that I really am entitled to wear red, pink maybe, but as you see I'm wearing yellow, and just let me tell you it has absolutely nothing to do with my politics. Nothing is more gratifying than to welcome a convert from the left, and not just from the left, but from the farthest reaches of the left. The brainwashed, indoctrinated left, the belly of the beast left, the America-hating, institution-crushing, destructive left. Such is our speaker tonight. Ron Radosh, author and scholar, is what is commonly known as a red diaper baby, steeped in the false promises of communism and socialism from the day he was born. He comes tonight to tell us the story of his remarkable life and journey through the old left, the new left, and the leftover left, toward the recognition and embrace of his own great country, America. Commies is the book that brings us here tonight, but it is not Ron's first book or his first exploration and insight into the left. With Joyce Milton, he wrote what was voted one of the 10 best books by the New York Times Book Review in 1983, The Rosenberg File. That book is considered to have established the truth of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg's guilt. In 1996, he chronicled the demise of the Democrats in the hands of the radical left. In Divided They Fell, the demise of the Democratic Party, 1964 to 1996. And in the Amerasia spy case, Prelude to McCarthyism, he again showed that communist spies really did threaten national security. I've only named 3 of many books, and I will add that Ron's work has appeared in more diverse periodicals than practically anyone I know, everything from Dissent on the left to National Review on the right. In all his writing, he is uniquely able to lay bare the myths that shield the leftist agenda and its protectors. Tonight, we shall see for ourselves how he was able to do that. We're in for some very interesting anecdotes. Mary Travers, expelled from the Little Red Schoolhouse in Manhattan. Bob Dylan looking for a place to crash. Bianca Jagger unbuttoning her blouse during an interview. And we will hear, no doubt, about what Ron calls the leftover left, that collection of thoughtless postures and grievances that are still with us in the form of radical feminism, political correctness, radical environmentalism, and multiculturalism. But we are, I believe, in for a great deal more. Those who have lived the lies and uncovered the truth by themselves have much to teach us. Ron is in the company of some rightly famous neocons who crossed from left to right. Norman Podhoretz, Irving Kristol, Gertrude Himmelfarb, David Horowitz, to name a few. But principal among these was Sidney Hook. It was Hook who helped Ron take the final step, as he describes. By this time, I was reading the work of earlier defectors from the left and was particularly struck by Sidney Hook's powerful autobiography, Out of Step. For many years, Hook had been intellectually and politically anathema to me. Now, reading his fine book, I realized that he had gone through an experience quite similar to mine decades earlier, at a time when the totalitarians of the left held major positions of influence in the cultural and political life of the nation, and standing apart from them meant being subjected to bitter calumnies. Hook defined the struggle for democracy as the need to stand against the totalitarianism of the left and the right. Despite all of its failings, drawbacks, and limitations, he wrote, the defense and survival of the West was the first priority. As I read these words in the 1990s, I had what Edmund Wilson once called the shock of recognition, and my eyes filled with tears. Let us welcome our friend and prodigal son, Ronald Radosh.
Thank you so much, Linda, for that really lovely introduction. I hope I can live up to the company of people that you put me among. Now, indeed, the book does have a lot of, I hope, interesting, sometimes humorous, sometimes bizarre anecdotes in them. But even though I filled book with anecdotes, what I've tried to do is something very serious. I tried to trace out my life, actually from childhood, from elementary school on, of which I actually have a lot of memories. Even then, as you'll see in a moment, it was a very politicized environment I was brought up in, all the way through to the recent period, singling out many different episodes that were critical in leading me to change the way I looked at the world. And the underlying theme of all the stories I tell and the episodes I recount and the people I talk about is how and why I was led to reevaluate and rethink some very fundamental assumptions I had shared for many, many years. So let me start at the beginning with just a brief introduction to my family and the world and the culture that I grew up in. My father was in a trade that now almost no longer exists, millinery, ladies' hats. If you remember the old pictures of the 1930s and 40s, the Easter parade with women marching with beautiful hats, he designed women's hats. He learned that in Poland, in the old country, and then brought his skill to this country and was a major designer. He was also very close to the Communist Party. If you want to be very literal, I really was not an authentic red diaper baby because neither my mother or father ever joined the Communist Party. But my father was the classic ultra fellow traveler, the person who joined and participated in all the party's front groups, met with the communist leaders, did their bidding, took part in all their campaigns, but was always hesitant for different reasons to join the party itself. The Communist Party, in fact, never would have had much of an impact in the United States if it didn't have the scores of fellow travelers who were in its orbit. He became the candidate for the president of the Hat, Cap, and Millinery Workers Union in the 1920s on the Communist Party front's ticket, which was then called the Trade Union Unity League, in a period when they were trying to split the AFL and form their own trade union federation. And ironically, he ran for president of the Hat, Cap, and Millinery Workers against a man who anyone who grew up in New York labor circles knew very well, a man named Alex Rose, who won that election in 1924 for presidency of the Union. Alex Rose later was the founder of the Liberal Party in the 1940s and was a major political kingmaker in New York circles. There were only two candidates in the 1924 election, my father and Alex Rose. And Alex Rose, my father was really a nice guy, and what he did is the ballots were supposed to be alphabetical. Radosh comes before Rose. And Alex Rose came to my father and said, "Ruby, you don't mind if I have my name first, do you?" And my father said, "Of course not." He didn't realize, my father was very naive, having only come to this country not much before 1924, in 1917 or 1918, I believe. And he agreed to let Alex Rose put his name first. Well, actually, people voted according to who was first on the ballot. A lot of people who were in those days couldn't even read and didn't even vote. There were two names, and Alex Rose won. And the history of New York trade unionism was quite different. My father went on to just be a rank-and-file worker and later formed his own business. My mother was actually much closer to the Jewish anarchist community in New York, very wary of the communists, but it was really one large circle, the culture and the society that Irving Howe described so well in The World of Our Fathers. That's the milieu they grew up in. The Daily Forward, the Social Democratic Jewish paper, the Daily Freiheit, the Communist Jewish paper, the Lower East Side. That was their world. Trade unionism, the Yiddish theater, Yiddish culture, and so forth. Now, a person who was of a great influence to me and my family was my mother's first cousin, who I knew as a very young child and as a teenager. His name was Jacob Abrams, and he was the name associated with one of the most famous Supreme Court cases in our country's history, Abrams versus the United States, the case in which Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes issued his famous dissent on the issue of freedom of speech and on the idea of a clear and present danger. Abrams, we always called him Abrams by his second name, had given out leaflets on the Lower East Side of New York opposing the Siberian expedition when troops were sent to fight the young Bolshevik regime in Russia. He gave out these leaflets, mind you, in one street of the Lower East Side in New York. And if you read the text of the leaflets, they're very comic. I mean, it says, workers of New York, go on a general strike. Do not stop the Siberian expedition. They were given out in very broken English, one side in Yiddish, one side in English. They were given out in one street corner, and he was arrested and found guilty of violation of the Espionage and Sedition Act, which forbids seditious utterances. And that's what Holmes issued his dissent on. He said that in the absence of any clear and present danger, the marketplace of ideas should allow any thoughts, no matter how repellent, to be heard. But Abrams, that was a dissent, and was considered Holmes's, or one of Holmes's most famous dissents. But Abrams was found guilty and sentenced to 25 years in prison. And after 2 years in prison, he cut a deal with the U.S. government that in exchange for never coming back to this country, he could be deported to his native Russia. And he would give up his American citizenship and be sent back to Russia. And he went to Russia and actually just got out of there within an inch of his life as the Stalin period was coming in and all the anarchists in Russia were being arrested, and he then fled to Mexico. Abrams was a great influence on me. And in fact, as I look back in it, he very early on, despite the milieu I grew up in, he raised issues that I couldn't understand at the time, but years later I would look back on and find to be have a great impact. For example, once when I think it was about, I'm not sure if it was a trip when I was 9 or 10 or 12, we went to visit him many times in Mexico. We went to the famous resort town of Cuernavaca. And we were walking on the town square of Cuernavaca, and a man came up to Abrams to shake his hand and approached him and said, "How are you, Abrams?" And he started screaming at him. And he was a gentle, mild, very lovely man. He started screaming at the top of his lungs. He said, "You murderer, you thug, get out of here. I don't talk to the likes of you. Do not even speak to me." And I was a young child, and I was quite amazed. I was very shaken. Oh, this came out of nowhere. The man just came up to say hello to him, and he was screaming at him, calling him a murderer. He then calmed down and explained to me that this was the mural painter, the Mexican muralist, David Alfaro Siqueiros, who, he explained, had tried to assassinate Leon Trotsky in the failed machine gun raid, one of the first KGB orchestrated assassination attempts on Trotsky that, as we all know, was eventually successful, carried out by Mercator a few years later. So he explained that to me. And he also gave me books, anarchist writings on the Spanish Civil War, and put in a notation and told me, "You won't understand these now, but years later you will read these and understand what they're about." And he was right. But he tried to always sow the seeds of doubt with me, even as a very, very young pre-teenager and teenager, about what communism was. And I would often sit in at family discussions. Abrams would be yelling and trying to explain to my parents what a monster Stalin was, and my parents were saying, but he was building a progressive society, and this was all above me. But I heard those kind of discussions. So Abrams was a great early influence. The other influence on the other side was somebody I never got to know, who was my mother's brother, my uncle, who took the Communist Party name Keith. My mother's family's name was Kreichman. Most of the Jewish communists changed their name in an effort to Americanize themselves. Irving Keith enlisted and became a commissar in the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, actually battalion, they call themselves a brigade, in the Spanish Civil War. And he was killed in action a few months after I was born. And for years, he was more or less the hero of the family. My mother and my aunt dearly missed their younger brother. He was the youngest member of the family, who they loved a great deal. And of course, they had heard a lot about him. We had the letters that I read later in life that he had sent to the family from Spain. And he was the epitome of a young communist who gave his life at a very early age in what he called the great anti-fascist struggle. So I grew up in this kind of climate, a very political climate based in the culture and the life of working class Jewish community in New York. I went